They called him Joe, though no one knew if that was his real name. Even on his license, which most of his regulars had never seen, the worn plastic just said, Joseph D. No last name. No address anyone could remember. And that was fine with him. Every morning before dawn, while the sidewalks were still slick from the city street cleaners, Joe would unlock the back of his rusty old panel van, roll out his little silver cart, and wheel it into position at the corner of 6th and Main. It squeaked the whole way, a faint metal-on-metal groan that everyone in that neighborhood had grown accustomed to. You could tell the time by it. Oh, there goes Joe. Must be 5:45. By the time he'd set up, stacking the white paper cups just so, lining up his syrups in a neat little rainbow row, polishing the shiny brass milk steamer until it gleamed in the street lamp light, the air already smelled of bitter roast and burnt caramel. It was a smell people craved, even if they didn't know why. Joe's customers came early, too. Construction foremen in orange vests. Secretaries in pencil skirts. Beat cops with weary eyes. Men in suits who barely looked at him when they ordered. They all came. Every morning. Loyal, even if only out of habit. Hey, Joe. Hey, buddy. Medium cappuccino, no foam. Make it quick, huh? Joe, my man. 2 sugars, extra cream, like always. You're still here, huh? Thought you'd have moved up by now. Hey, Joe, millionaire yet? Ha ha. And Joe smiled. Every time. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that this morning was different. This morning, he really was. 6:12 a.m. Right on schedule, his regular line stretched a good 10 customers deep. Joe worked fast, just like always. No wasted motion. No extra words. People always said his cart was the cleanest in the city, and his hands moved like he'd been born making coffee. Steam hissed. Milk frothed. Beans ground in steady little growls. It was almost hypnotic. But under the counter, in the lowest drawer, behind the extra filters and stir sticks, a little red prepaid phone buzzed softly against the steel. He didn't even look down at it at first. He didn't need to. It buzzed again. And again. On the 4th buzz, Joe finally reached under the counter, fingers closing over the plastic like he'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. He ducked his head and pressed it to his ear. It's done, he said quietly, his tone calm but cool. The transfer cleared overnight. Every penny. For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then a low chuckle. A voice like smoke. Congratulations, Joe. You're officially a ghost. Now walk away. You've served your last cup of coffee. Joe didn't reply. Didn't even say goodbye. He hung up, slid the phone back into the drawer, and went back to frothing milk, his face just as serene as before. By 7:03 a.m., the rush was at its peak. People barking orders, digging into pockets, waving cards and cash at him. Joe poured, smiled, handed back change. He even laughed at the same old jokes. Hey, Joe, bet you're rich by now, huh? Joe, what are you still doing here, man? Shoulda bought yourself a cafe by now. And Joe kept smiling. Because by tomorrow morning, none of them would be laughing anymore. They wouldn't even find him. At exactly 7:31 a.m., Joe leaned against his cart, watching the endless stream of people rushing down Main Street. He took a slow sip from his own cup, black, no sugar. And he thought about the number he'd seen on his phone screen just minutes earlier. $3,934,000.17. Transferred. Cleared. Untouchable. And just like that, the weight he'd carried for years, the jokes, the debt, the humiliations, began to slip from his shoulders. He wasn't poor anymore. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just the coffee guy anymore. Now he was free. You ever dream of a moment like that? The kind of morning where you know you've finally outsmarted everyone? Tell me what you'd do next, right here in the comments. Would you stay and gloat? Or vanish before anyone knew what hit them? That morning, as the last of the regulars drifted off to their cubicles and job sites, the street corner fell quiet. The hum of the city softened, just the distant hiss of a bus, the faint murmur of tires on asphalt. And Joe stood there behind his cart, staring at nothing, feeling the quiet settle around him like a blanket. For the first time in years, he let himself stand still. At 8:11 a.m. sharp, a black sedan eased up to the curb. He didn't flinch when the passenger window rolled down. "You're done here," said the man inside. No greeting. No smile. No name. Just a flat stare, and that same smoky voice from the phone earlier. Joe gave a faint nod. "1 more hour. Then I'm gone." The man didn't answer, didn't press him. The window rolled back up, and the sedan glided back into the river of morning traffic. But Joe could still feel the weight of those eyes on him long after the car disappeared. He reached under the counter and let his hand rest on the duffel bag hidden under the towels and paper napkins. It was heavier than it looked, not just with the cash he'd been slipping away piece by piece these last few months, but heavier with what it meant. It meant he was finally free of them. Free of all of this. Years earlier, Joe wasn't always a coffee man. Before the cart, before the corner, he'd worn a different uniform. Pressed suits, polished shoes, leather briefcase. He'd walked through the revolving doors of one of the biggest banks in the city every morning, back straight, tie perfect. He was good at it. Maybe too good. And that was his mistake. When he uncovered the embezzlement scheme running right under the CFO's nose, he thought he was doing the right thing by reporting it. But instead of being praised, he was blacklisted. Silenced. They stripped him of his title, froze his accounts, and buried him in lawsuits until he couldn't even afford rent. And just like that, Joseph D., became the guy with the coffee cart. It was while he was living out of his car, nursing cold cups of instant brew, that he came up with the plan. The perfect, quiet, untraceable plan. "They think I'm nobody now," he'd said to himself, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. "So they'll never see me coming." And he was right. Day by day, cup by cup, he built it. A little network of quiet allies. A trail of small transactions so subtle no one even noticed the money moving at first. They just thought he'd faded into nothing. And now here he was, standing in the morning sun, the wind rustling his apron, with $3.9 million already in an offshore account. He turned his attention back to his cart, wiping down the counter, making sure everything was spotless, not for his customers anymore, but for himself. Because this was the last time he'd ever do it. This was his last morning as Joe. By 9:05 a.m., the crowd had thinned completely. All that remained were a few stragglers, a delivery guy on his bike, a woman in yoga pants checking her phone, a stray dog sniffing the sidewalk. Joe took a deep breath, looked up at the skyscrapers towering over him, and let himself smile. It felt strange at first. Real. Then he rolled the cart back toward the alley, unfastened his apron, and tossed it into the trash. He left the cart locked up in its usual spot, clean, orderly, as if nothing unusual had happened. And then he walked away. Have you ever been underestimated? Overlooked? Written off? How did it feel to prove everyone wrong? Drop your story in the comments. You never know who you might inspire. Joe didn't go home. He didn't even have a home anymore. That was the first part of the plan. No paper trail. No permanent address. Nothing the city, or anyone else, could pin on him. For months, he'd been sleeping in short-term hostels, renting under fake names, paying cash for everything. And now it was time for the second part. The streets were already heating up as he walked away from the corner of 6th and Main. The sun climbed higher, baking the sidewalks, making the asphalt shimmer like a mirage. But Joe didn't notice. His mind was somewhere else, on the details he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. Step 1. Change clothes. He ducked into a public restroom 3 blocks away, stripping off the polo and khakis he'd worn every day on the cart. In their place, a pressed shirt, dark jeans, sunglasses. Step 2. Ditch the bag. At a bus terminal locker, he removed the heavy duffel he'd kept under his cart for months and replaced it with a nearly identical one, this one empty except for towels and a few newspaper clippings. He carried the real duffel, the one filled with old dirty bills he'd been skimming for years, and walked it calmly back to the locker. No cameras could prove when or where he'd made the swap. And the bills? Untraceable. 2 years earlier. It had started small. $1 here, $2 there. Change slipped into his pocket, small amounts transferred between digital accounts no one bothered to monitor. Cash tips tucked into the lining of the cart. No one thought to check the coffee guy. He was invisible. But behind the smile and the steaming cups of Joe, he was building something. He knew exactly how the bank's payment processors worked, the weaknesses, the gaps in oversight. And over time, those pennies became dollars, and those dollars became thousands. By the time he'd perfected his system, he was moving tens of thousands each week. Small enough to avoid alarms. Big enough to matter. Now, in the locker, the final phase began. Joe opened the duffel and checked the contents. Neatly wrapped stacks of bills, bundled and banded, all sorted by denomination. And resting on top, a small passport bearing a different name, with stamps from countries he'd never even visited yet. A second red phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He answered without hesitation. "You're clear," said the smoky voice. "Private car waiting at 11th and Madison. You know the drill." "I know." He hung up and the private car was already waiting when he arrived. A sleek black sedan idling quietly by the curb, driver in a cap and gloves, no questions asked. Joe slid into the back seat and set the duffel on the floor at his feet. The driver only glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Airport." "Yeah. But the long way." "Understood." The sedan pulled away, merging smoothly into traffic. Joe leaned back against the cool leather and finally let himself breathe. He thought about all the years he'd spent on that corner, the insults, the pitying smiles, the loneliness. And he thought about what was waiting for him on the other side of this ride. You ever have a plan nobody believed in? A dream you kept quiet because no one would understand? Drop your answer in the comments. There's power in the quiet ones. The ride to the airport was quiet. Too quiet. Joe kept his eyes fixed on the passing streets, memorizing every turn, every stoplight. Even now, with nearly $4 million to his name and nothing tying him to his old life, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching. Back on 6th and Main, people began to notice. The regulars stopped at the corner, confused by the empty sidewalk. The cart was gone. The usual smell of roasted coffee, gone. The quiet man in the apron who'd stood there every morning for years, gone. One man in particular didn't like it. Detective Marcus Avery had been watching Joe for weeks. From a distance, of course. After all, what was there to watch? He was just a coffee guy. But Avery wasn't convinced. Something about Joe had always felt off. Too precise. Too quiet. Too clean. And when he saw that the cart wasn't there this morning, something in his gut told him he was right. "Detective Avery," the captain barked over the phone. "What the hell are you doing chasing a barista? We've got real cases to solve." But Avery just stared at the empty sidewalk where Joe used to stand. You ever see a guy who makes minimum wage get his hands on a vintage 1954 La Pavoni espresso machine? Silence on the other end of the line. "Didn't think so." Avery hung up. He wasn't letting this go. Meanwhile, Joe's car wound its way through the city's industrial district, weaving through trucks and warehouses until it finally reached a private gate at the edge of the airport. A guard in a reflective vest stepped out, clipboard in hand. He barely looked at Joe as he waved them through. The sedan rolled onto the tarmac, pulling up alongside a sleek private jet already humming with power. A flight attendant stood at the base of the stairs, her hair whipping in the wind. Joe stepped out, duffel in hand. He didn't look back. Not once. But what he didn't know was that he wasn't as invisible as he thought. At that very moment, Avery stood at the bus terminal, staring at the locker Joe had used to hide his empty decoy bag. The lock was still warm. And Avery was smiling. "Gotcha," he murmured. The jet's door closed. The engines roared to life. Joe leaned back in his leather seat, fingers tracing the smooth handle of the duffel. For the first time in years, he felt weightless. Free. Or so he thought. Have you ever thought you'd gotten away with something, only to find out you were being watched the whole time? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear how it felt when the tables turned. The jet soared above the clouds, leaving behind the city skyline like a memory fading in the rearview mirror. Joe sat with his seatbelt fastened, staring out the oval window, his duffel bag tucked securely at his feet. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine what came next. A warm beach somewhere. A quiet house with no neighbors. No more mornings on the corner, no more jokes, No more, "Hey Joe," from people who didn't even know his name. He was done. Or at least, he thought he was. Far below, Detective Avery wasn't resting. By noon, he'd already spoken to the bank's fraud unit, leaned on a couple of old contacts in cybercrime, and traced a string of tiny, barely noticeable rounding errors in a handful of offshore accounts. All of them led back to one name, Joseph D. "Coffee guy my ass," Avery muttered, shoving another file into his bag. "This guy's been playing the long game." By the time Joe's jet landed on a private airstrip on a Caribbean island, Avery was already at the airport back home, boarding the next commercial flight out. He didn't need a warrant. Didn't even need backup. Because to him, this wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle. Nobody outsmarts Marcus Avery on his streets. Meanwhile, Joe was already being greeted with a glass of champagne at a seaside villa, the waves crashing against the rocks in the distance. He stepped out onto the balcony, letting the salty breeze whip through his hair. He'd made it. No one could touch him now. Or so he thought. But the thing about ghosts is that sooner or later, someone decides to go hunting. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Joe walked down to the beach and stood with his feet in the cool sand. He watched a fishing boat bob on the water. He let the champagne bubbles tickle his throat. And then he saw it, far off in the distance. A plane descending toward the island. A silhouette stepping off the ramp hours later, trench coat in hand, eyes scanning the villa lights in the hills. Detective Avery had arrived. Have you ever felt like you'd escaped, only to feel the chill of someone right behind you? Drop your story in the comments below, and tell me what you'd do if you were Joe right now. The Caribbean night was thick with heat and salt, the air humming with the sound of distant waves and quiet insects. Joe didn't sleep. Couldn't. He sat on the balcony of his villa, the stars stretched wide above him, the duffel bag still resting by his chair. Every sound in the darkness made his heart tick faster. A crunch of gravel. A whisper of wind through the palm trees. He told himself it was just nerves. But deep down, he knew better. Somewhere on the island, Avery was hunting him. That morning, Joe made his move. He rose before dawn, dressed in light linen, and packed the duffel into a plain canvas bag. He left the villa without a word to the house staff, slipping through a back gate and down a narrow path to the dock. Waiting for him was a fishing boat, old but fast, already fueled and ready to go. He handed the captain an envelope thick with cash. "No names. No questions," he said. The captain just nodded, lit a cigarette, and started the engine. Within minutes, they were slicing through the waves toward a neighboring island where his next safe house waited. Joe allowed himself a tight smile. Still one step ahead. But what he didn't see was the second boat. Half a mile back, its lights off, cutting through the surf like a black knife. And at the helm, trench coat off now, sleeves rolled up, was Detective Marcus Avery. Eyes locked on the fishing boat's wake, a faint smirk curling his lip. "You really thought you'd lose me in paradise, huh, Joe?" he murmured to himself. "Not a chance." By the time Joe stepped onto the dock at the next island, the sun was climbing. He felt the warmth on his face and let himself breathe. The little safe house was just up the hill, hidden among the palms, quiet, stocked, and ready for him to vanish completely. But as he rounded the corner of the dock, he froze. Avery was already there, leaning casually against a post, hands in his pockets, watching him with that same infuriating little smirk. "Morning, Joe." Joe's pulse hammered in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Detective," he said evenly. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Beautiful day for a confession," Avery shot back. "Or maybe just a deal." Joe's fingers tightened around the handle of the bag. So this was it. The final game. What would you do if you were Joe right now? Stand your ground and fight for your freedom? Or cut another deal and try to slip away? Let me know in the comments below. Your move might change everything. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The dock groaned under the weight of the two men, the water lapping gently at the pylons below. Overhead, seagulls wheeled lazily in the blue morning sky, mocking them with their indifference. Joe tightened his grip on the bag that had cost him everything, the bag that was supposed to buy him his freedom. "What do you want, Avery?" Joe finally said, his voice low and calm. "You've followed me halfway around the world. Why? You want the money? Take it. You want me? Fine. But at least tell me why you care so damn much." Avery's smirk softened, and for the first time, his eyes didn't look quite so hard. "Because, Joe," he said quietly, stepping closer, "I used to believe in justice. Until I started working in this city. You think you're the only one they chewed up and spat out? No. But the difference is, you did something about it. And I didn't." Joe's brow furrowed, but he didn't speak. Avery took another step forward. "I'm not here to ruin your life, Joe. Not really. I just need to know if you're gonna waste this chance. Or make it count." Joe's chest rose and fell as he processed the words. He looked down at the bag, then back at Avery. "What's your deal, then?" he asked finally. "You gonna drag me back? Or you gonna let me walk?" Avery's lips pressed into a thin line. And then he shrugged. "Let's just say I didn't see you here." Joe blinked, stunned. You mean that?" Avery leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't screw it up. Because next time, I won't be so generous." By the time the sun was fully up, Joe was walking the quiet streets of the little island village, the bag still in his hand, his heart finally starting to slow. For the first time in years, he didn't feel hunted. He felt alive. And somewhere on the next dock, Marcus Avery stood watching him walk away, a faint smile on his lips. Maybe justice didn't always look like it was supposed to. But sometimes, it still showed up. And what about you? If you'd been Joe, would you have walked away with the money? Or turned yourself in? Drop your answer in the comments. We're all dying to know how you'd play the final hand.